Welcome back, everybody. This Week in America. Great to have you with us on the program today. Website thisweekinamerica.us. Author John Brewer's passion for history unfolds in the pages of his historical fiction novels, action, adventure, romance. John moved frequently while living in Kansas, Oklahoma, California, Alaska, and Alberta, Canada. Studied at Johns Hopkins University, BA in biology, Ph.D. in biochemistry. Took his postdoctoral experience at the University of Illinois from 1963 to 1966. Career started at the University of Georgia in 1966, from assistant to associate to full professor at the University of Georgia. He has over 100 professional scientific publications. He's been reading history books as a hobby for many years and is the author of a series of historical fiction novels. He's with us on This Week in America today to talk about his World War I trilogy. And John Brewer, back with us on the program. John, it is great to have you back with us on the show today.
Satisfied customers always.
Always return. Well, I appreciate that. It is always fun to have you back with us on the program. Specifically, we're talking about 3 books in the World War I trilogy: Matthew Dobbs, Esquire, Terpsichore, and Goodman's Croft. And we'll talk about briefly some of the other books that you have written and a new one that you're working on. Before we do that, let's set the stage here if we're talking about the World War I trilogy. What is it that was so fascinating to you about that period in time that you did the 3 books? What was it that captured your attention, and how far back does that go?
Well, we're now in the centennial
Yes.
of the First World War. In a couple of months, we'll have the centennial of the Battle on the Somme, in which the British Army lost more men, suffered more casualties in a few minutes than they've ever lost before or since. I think it was the scale of the casualties that everyone remembered. The British, the French were attacking, and the tactics employed were just inappropriate for the weapons available. And the result was losses on a scale that no one expected. And to this day, the British and the French still remember. The French never recovered from that war and collapsed when the Germans attacked again 25 years later. The British employed different tactics, but once again, it took the American intervention to bring that war to a successful conclusion.
I mentioned in the beginning of the program all of the moving you did as a child, and I say that because that really helped shape you. You mentioned before that there was a shyness that you had, part of that probably because of constantly moving and meeting new people, and your escape was really delving into books. So this fascination with history and this desire to write, I'm assuming then that goes back to the childhood when books were an escape for you.
Books and daydreaming. My wife says that reading history is my hobby and daydreaming is my vice.
Well, and it's interesting because the daydreaming, they both have led to the success with all of the historical novels we're talking about. John's website is very simple, historomance.com, HISTO romance.com. You go to our website, thisweekinamerica.us, and link on directly. John Brewer, our guest on the program. You had this fascination with history and daydream, and some very elaborate daydreams. Many of these play out in the products that we see, the books we're talking about, in this case, the World War I trilogy. Talk about that, because obviously it wasn't just a daydream and you could walk away and let it go. You had some elaborate daydreams there, didn't you?
When you start writing, I've found that things just grow. I start out with a plot, and it just grows and grows and grows and eventually converges to a conclusion. In that sense, I mentioned this before, the books kind of write themselves. I work them out in my head, but they take over. and drive me on to the end of the book.
You know, it's interesting. The comments you get, they almost always begin with, they love the attention to detail. And obviously, that's something that you pride yourself on. We'll talk about the historical accuracy here in a second, but the detail, these are really well-rounded characters. As we're reading about them, we really feel we know them, we understand them. How difficult is that to take a character and really fully develop the character so we really understand even the little nuances?
Uh, Genius helps.
Yes, it takes a very bright mind to be able to do this.
uh, I don't know. As I said, I tend to work these things out in my head, sometimes to the very dialogue that I'm going to use. But even then, when I'm writing, the story may just get away and take off in some direction of its own. I create the characters. They're fairly believable characters, I think.
Definitely.
And just set them in place, and they interact. That's the fascinating part. And they're in this time. In the case of the World War I, a time of testing. The contrast between the conditions under which men had to serve and then being allowed to go home on leave, and where the life was going on pretty much as before, was even now startling. You get some really grisly stories about the experience of men in the trenches from that time, some of which I describe. The post-traumatic stress syndrome that people talk about now, that is now a recognized ailment. Then it wasn't, but people suffered from it. This is now, in retrospect, obvious.
I mentioned the accuracy, which again is a calling card. John Brewer, with us on the program, author of a number of historical novels. Histo-Romance is his website. You can go directly to thisweekinamerica.us and link on at that point. Talk about the importance of accuracy. And as I'm reading this, and I understand it's not a history book, but I'm understanding the condition at the time and feel like this is a real accurate portrayal of what's happening during this time period.
I try to make it so. The incidents, the conditions, these were real, unfortunately. And as I said, they were awful.
Yeah, dreadful conditions.
People were living in a latrine and a charnel house. Dead bodies, bits of bodies. They would try to bury them. You'd find these photographs taken of trenches with a cluster of little white wooden crosses here and there stuck behind it. But for example, the rats would infest the battlefields that everyone hated. They grew on the corpses. That's what they ate.
It's
and
just
very large.
It's amazing, and what you will find in the World War I trilogy. Let's talk about the books briefly individually. The first in the series is Matthew Dobbs, Esquire. Talk a little bit about the Matthew's background and the storyline in that book.
Well, I don't write my books in terms of, well, I'll write about this theme or that theme or the other. I just tell stories. And later on, it will occur to me that, hey, there's a theme in that book, or two or three. The overriding theme in the first one is social status and position. Matthew grows up, he's an orphan, grows up in a very strange household. uh, where he learns basically to skulk and hide, and uh, he's outside of society. And he meets this upper class girl, beautiful girl, and he's really taken with her. She can't figure him out. He does not fit. And that's one of the things about him. He doesn't fit anywhere. He wants to be a gentleman. He wants social status. Eventually, he finds it through service in the military. But he's just an outsider. The girl he eventually marries is herself, in some respects, like that. But he sees things from the outside. And sometimes this is very helpful, and sometimes it gets him into trouble.
The thing that's so believable is these are real people. They have flaws just like real people. Sometimes you see a superhero that makes his way through the novel and you don't fully appreciate them because we can't relate to them. Your characters we can relate to because we see the good, the bad, and the ugly in these.
Matthew is lucky. That's the one thing you have to remember about him. He survives.
Yes.
And indeed, in a sense, he flourishes. Uh, he's a quirky individual. But he thinks outside the box, and sometimes that's very helpful. But as I said, sometimes that gets him into trouble.
Matthew Dobbs Esquire is the first book in the series, first book in the World War I trilogy we're discussing. The second one is terpsichore. Talk about the genesis of that word.
Well, I've read that it's supposed to be pronounced terpsichore. That's the proper pronunciation, but I think in this country people call it terpsichore. But the original meaning in Greek was delights in dancing. And this is Michael Renard's one social skill. He can dance. He learned it the hard way. He worked very hard, but on a dance floor, he is the man. He's supremely confident, self-assured, but only there. Otherwise, he's an underpaid, unappreciated teacher in an English public school. He's not very attractive, and he wants love. He wants romance, and eventually he finds this girl. Ironically enough, she can't dance at all. But she learns, she picks these things up. She marries him, well, she's called a social climber, and I suppose that's true. It's to get out of a very bad situation where she's sexually harassed all the time. But the overall theme of the book is social isolation. The three principal characters in the book all grow up socially isolated. Two of them overcome this through their love for each other. The third does not and descends into madness and death. But courtship, marriage, service as an army officer involves repetitive actions, repetitive scenes, a kind of dance. But basically, dancing is, as I said, the one thing he's good at.
Yeah, his escape. That's where he goes on the dance floor. And like you said, he is the man at that point. All of a sudden, here's this guy that's really having a hard time. He is the man when it goes on the dance floor. Good Man's Croft is the third in the trilogy. Talk about David Mendy.
He grows up in the country. His mother left his father. So he grows up with his father, who's not very communicative, and he tends to live a lot on his own. He's interested in history. The area where he lives, he thinks, is rich in history, which includes this untilled, uncultivated plot of land called the Goodman's Croft, which is a real custom. It died out in Western Scotland in the early part of the 19th century. It involved leaving a patch of land for the good man, the spirit of the land. It's pre-Christian, goes back probably 6 millennia to the introduction of agriculture into Britain. And I moved it for artistic purposes, artistic license. And yes, I have been accused of practicing literature without a license to central England. But it's quite possible that custom took place there. Otherwise, he's of Basque origin. Mendi means hill in Basque. But he meets this woman, and one of the themes of the book is romance. The woman he marries is a complete romantic, and unfortunately, David he's a doctor. He has to keep his eye on what he does, on his patients, and when he's up serving at the front, on his patients there. But she's the one who lives in the fantasy world, and that leads her to fall into the company of this psychopath. The guy who owns whose family owns the land that contains the local Goodman's Croft. He's a homosexual pedophile, so it's a rather dark story.
Yes.
But David likes to keep going back to the Goodman's Croft or its vicinity because he was told that his family's ancestral home was there. And unfortunately, this other guy is going back there for some other purposes and does not like company. And sooner or later, well,
You have to read the book to find out what happens sooner or later. It's like all of John's books, it is a compelling story on a number of levels. The World War I trilogy we're talking about, Matthew Dobbs Esquire, Terpsichore, that's the way I'll pronounce it, and Goodman's Croft. Those are the three in the trilogy. Other books that John has written, Millwood Village LLC, that's a sequel to Matthew Dobbs Esquire, Pilgrim's Journey, and Golden Mary. I think we discussed that the last time John was with us on the program. All of these books are available at the usual places, information, and you can also purchase the books at John's website, which is historomance.com, HISTO romance.com. And about to be published, I understand, is Quest. How are you coming with that? We might have mentioned that the last time. I know that you're working on that. How is that progressing?
Right now, filling in gaps, polishing. Right now, it runs just under 49,000 words. I don't think the length of the book is necessarily any indication of quality, but I'm just trying to complete the story, flesh it out. But it's basically done. In this case, it's set in northwestern Nevada, north central Nevada, currently. The hero is trying to find a romance. Well, he's questing for a number of things. He's trying to get some answers about a real finding about 1900. some people were digging bat guano out of a cave near Lovelock, Nevada, and about 4 feet down discovered a lot of bodies.
Interesting.
And the Paiutes, the tribe that's nearby, said that they belonged to a bunch of very tall people with red hair and blue eyes who were cannibals. And the Paiutes chased them into the cave, built a fire in front of the cave mouth, and suffocated them. This is true. So he's on a quest to find out how old these remains are, where they came from. And incidentally, well, there are 3 women involved. One he married, that didn't work out too well. Another one he's courting, and then there's a third one who's his boss, and things work together, and in the end, things get a little exciting.
I'm sure of that, and I'm looking forward to reading John's newest quest. Unfortunately, out of time. Interesting discussion, as always, talking about John's World War I trilogy, Matthew Dobbs Esquire, Terpsichore, and Goodman's Croft. Information on all of John's books available at historomance.com. Link on our website, thisweekinamerica.us, and you'll get directly to John's website and information on the books. John, it is always a pleasure. Thank you so much once again being with us on the program. Great to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you. Enjoyed it.
It is always fun, and looking forward to hopefully the next time we'll be talking about Quest. The trilogy available at John's website, historomance.com. And, of course, information on John and all of our guests at our website, thisweekinamerica.us.